Okay, welcome everybody to The Rise of Vladimir Putin with Professor Stephen Barnes of George Mason University. Welcome to those at home, those at Lubber Run, and those from other jurisdictions joining us through the Virtual Center for Active Adults platform. Arlington County is very proud to be partnering with other local Northern Virginia jurisdictions to share free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities through VCAA. Thank you, Nicole Waller, for handling everything for VCAA. Thank you to Charlika Ashton, supervisor for Arlington County's 55+ virtual program, who manages Arlington's virtual programming so beautifully. And also a big thank you to Nick England, Arlington's 55+ operations supervisor, for all that you are doing to make it possible for our participants to view this from the Lubber Run Center. This program is being recorded, and the recording will be posted at a later time on Arlington County's 55+ YouTube channel. And now I'm honored and delighted to introduce our speaker, Professor Stephen Barnes. Professor Stephen Barnes is an associate professor of Russian history at George Mason University and the director of Mason's program in Russian and Eurasian Studies. He teaches courses on Russian and Soviet history and is engaged in research on the history of Soviet forced labor camp system, the Gulag, and the global history of the concentration camp as a modern form of population control. He is the author of a multi-award-winning book called Death and Redemption: The Gulag and the Shaping of Soviet Society. He's currently completing a book on a Stalinist Gulag camp for women who were arrested merely for being the wives of men who were themselves unjustly repressed. Also, Professor Barnes has organized a fascinating online speaker series with leading historians all over the country, reflecting on how their historical research and teaching help them make sense of Russia's war on the Ukraine. The series will begin on Monday, September 12th from 3 to 4:15 p.m. and will continue on a weekly basis in that time slot. It is online, free, and open to the public. So this is a very exciting opportunity for you to learn more about the Russian war on Ukraine. For more information and to register, I'm going to re-enter the link in the chat once I get finished. And I'll also send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with the link in it. Please hold your questions until the end. You're welcome to enter your questions in the chat as we go along, or at the end, please feel free to unmute yourself and just ask your question. And now it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Professor Stephen Barnes.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. It's definitely much better to be inside talking and thinking about history than to be outside on a hot day like today. Give me just a second. I'm going to share my screen with you. And get started. So, what I want to do today is to talk to you about the origins of Vladimir Putin and the origins of what we might call Putinism in Russia, without, in fact, talking about Vladimir Putin. So what I plan to do is to talk about the 1990s in Russia, but also to leave time at the end for us to talk more about Putin himself and to talk about this criminal war that Putin is carrying out on Ukraine, and we can talk about that in the Q&A period. But what I want to do is to take you back to those glorious years of 1989 and 1991, when in the United States anyway, we felt a tremendous optimism. I sat in a Harvard dorm room as a freshman in college when I watched the television news as people danced on top of the Berlin Wall. By the time I graduated from college, the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, as this man, Boris Yeltsin, heroically stood upon a tank to face down a coup attempt of communist hardliners in August of 1991. So how did the people of Russia, and I'm going to emphasize here that I'm going to talk about Russia and not about the stories of the 14 other countries that became independent with the end of the Soviet Union, but how did the people of Russia experience the end of the Soviet Union? How did they experience that, and how did they experience what came next? How do we go from a moment where, if you look at this poll in 1991, where people who were asked whether they believed in a democratic form of government or whether they preferred a strong leader, we have a slim majority who believe in the democratic form of government in 1991. By the time Pew does this poll again in 2002, we have 70% of the population saying that they preferred a strong leader. So how do we get from one to the other? What happened in this period between 1991 and 2002 to help us understand this? I believe the authoritarianism that we identify in Vladimir Putin's Russia finds its origins not just with Putin, but with the 1990s. I wouldn't say that the 1990s made the rise of authoritarianism in Russia inevitable, but it clearly plowed and fertilized a field in which authoritarianism could certainly thrive. So the Soviet Union was over at the end of 1991. What comes next? Here it's important for us to understand something, which is that the Soviet system was not just an authoritarian regime. It was an economic system. It was an economic system in which there was no private ownership of the means of production. That is to say that the entirety of the economy, and there are a few small exceptions we could talk about, but really the entirety of the economy was in the hands of the government, was owned by the government. Furthermore, the market did not operate in the Soviet Union. It did not determine what was produced. It didn't determine how much was produced, and it didn't determine what price items were sold at. These were all government decisions. Most of the economy in the late Soviet period was unprofitable. It was subsidized largely by the Soviet Union's export of oil and natural gas, precisely in the decades of the 1970s and the early half of the 1980s, at a time when oil and natural gas prices were at what had been quite historic highs. So when the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of 1991, a major task lay in front of them. It's something that would come to be called transition, as they moved from that Soviet style of economy to a new style of economy. It turned out to be a lot more complicated than those who had blindly held on to a faith in the hidden hand of the market. It was a complicated and difficult process. And it led to a lot of questions, this transition to capitalism. Questions like, how quickly should this happen? How would the economy be turned over into private hands? Should prices be allowed to float free immediately? What would happen to an economy that was dependent upon state subsidy if those subsidies were suddenly withdrawn? How do you develop the laws and the legal system, the regulatory apparatus, all of these kinds of things that are necessary for an economic system to enforce contracts, to resolve business disputes, to protect private property? What is the role of the social safety net? How do you privatize social goods like healthcare, like government-supported retirement and pensions? Do you protect an older generation that prepared to retire based on a certain set of rules and who are going to be the ones hurt most by this transition? And what happens when you're going to do all that in a moment when the price of oil and natural gas, far and away the most profitable export of the Soviet economy, is at, in fact, historic lows? So this is the period that we're talking about primarily today. So from 1985, when Gorbachev came into power, the last Soviet leader who would try to reform the system, until the late 1990s, we're talking about a period of extremely low oil prices, which in an economy that was so dependent upon the export of oil and natural gas was going to make all of these problems much more difficult. The impact of the decisions that were made, the impact of the answers to those questions, the impact of the so-called transition to capitalism would prove absolutely devastating to the vast majority of the population. Were there better answers to these questions than the ones that were chosen? Maybe. Or perhaps the Soviet economy was such a basket case that its reform would have inevitably led to the collapse that would come. Foreign so-called experts advised the Russian government to transition rapidly by privatizing the economy and withdrawing state subsidies to reduce government spending and supposedly thereby to control the rate of inflation. This would mean prices and the value of the currency were to float freely. The elimination of subsidies closed the many unprofitable factories and other economic enterprises in the economy. This resulted in massive job losses, and for those companies that attempted to continue operating, it resulted in unpaid wages, or it resulted in wages paid in what was a declining currency. And in fact, letting prices float freely led to extreme inflation in this economy, an inflation that, by the way, was hard to measure. But one set of figures from the historian Stephen Kotkin can give us an indication of the direction, even if there are different estimates of the exact numbers that I'm going to talk about here. Kotkin writes that inflation by late 1991, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, had reached somewhere between 200 and 250% per month. Per month. Imagine this wipes out the life savings that many had in rubles. If you're paid a salary or a pension in rubles, it quickly amounts to nothing. It leads, of course, to a mass push to get dollars, to hold on to dollars, actual dollar bills, to get some kind of stable currency. But this, in fact, then further decreases the value of the ruble. This has a tremendous impact on the quality of life, and it makes the negotiation of long-term business deals nearly impossible. It in the end ends up being a vicious negative feedback loop. So from Kotkin, let's go on the annual rates for inflation, annual rates here. In 1992, the first year of independent Russia, for the year, 2,250%. Imagine that, right? We're complaining right now about 9% annual inflation, 2,250%. 1993 was better, only 840% for the year. 1994, 224%. And we start to reach some stability by the time we get to 1996, but by stability here, I'm talking high double digits. The economy, in fact, became such a basket case that even in the sphere of oil and natural gas production, we see steep declines in output. And this was, in fact, the profitable part of the economy. So we have a Russian economy that over the course of the 1990s is going to shrink by something like 50%. By most accounts, it shrinks by a larger percentage than the drop seen in the size of the US economy during the Great Depression. The end of the Soviet system meant that for many, the end of the Soviet Union for many meant that capitalism and the market and being like the West, in fact, comes to mean collapse rather than meaning the good times that they were looking for. And then we should think about privatization, how they got the economy into the hands of private individuals. When you have an economy of something like 150 million people, even if it is smaller proportionally than the US economy, this still is an economy that contains enormous wealth and enormous temptation to benefit from that wealth as it is moved into private hands. I'm not going to go into all the details of the privatization process today, but let's summarize it like this. In principle, right, if we think about it, an economy that is owned by the government should, by rights, belong to the entirety of the population, and the entirety of the population should benefit equally in its privatization. In reality, what happens in Russia is that a very small number of very well-connected people are able to obtain controlling interests in economic enterprises at well below fair market value through their corrupt control over who even had access to the privatization process. Basically, people in the 1990s are going to become instant billionaires. And it's a whole corrupt business that basically transfers the wealth of the state into a small number of hands, into the hands of those who come to be called the Russian oligarchs. So if we look at this chart, we can see something of the rise of inequality in post-Soviet Russia. So this is a measure of the share of the economy that is taken home by the top 10% of earners in an economic system, right? So absolute economic equality would have everybody taking every 10%, taking home 10% of the total size of the economy. What you'll see is that the Soviet system itself was never fully egalitarian, but compared to what was to come in the 1990s, when economic inequality shot through the roof, and when in fact Russia becomes so unequal that it rivals the United States in terms of inequality, this is the experience of the 1990s. If you didn't get economic enterprises in this process, by the way, you got big bribes, and government functionaries themselves also often became billionaires. So we end up in the 1990s, right, with this very small class of incredibly wealthy oligarchs who are known and reviled by the population for the profligate nature of their spending. And then we have a vast population that is suffering from the economic collapse. And they're basically selling everything that they own, everything they can get their hands on, everything they can possibly create just to try to survive. So, right, we have in the 1990s then a smaller total economic pie, right? The total size of the economy is smaller. And then we think about it, right? We have the 90% of the population getting a smaller portion of a smaller pie. So it all tends to enhance the negative economic impact for the vast majority of the population here. And it's all, of course, inordinately corrupt, and everybody knows it. So what I want to emphasize here in thinking about the 1990s is that economic collapse and an inordinate, seemingly unfair economic inequality will pave the way for the appearance of an authoritarian strongman. Now, the economy only really turns around when oil and gas prices turn around. So we see the economy hit a bottom really in 1998. If we look at world oil prices, we'll see, in fact, that world oil prices are also at a low in 1998. But the one thing that I wanted to point out to you here is that that economic rebound starts before Vladimir Putin becomes president. And so although he will claim a certain mythology that says that the economic rebound was entirely the doing of Vladimir Putin, it starts before he even comes to office. So what does the political realm look like in this era? As you might imagine, right, there emerged a significant opposition to the reform programs, to the process of privatization, to the way all of this was happening. Especially within the Russian parliament, this opposition begins to emerge. And by 1993, we have an ongoing feud between the parliament and President Yeltsin's administration. Primarily, we're going to see a back and forth, and I won't go through all the details here, but Parliament tries to impeach Yeltsin. Yeltsin tries to disband the Parliament, each of them refusing to accept the legitimacy of the other. And it's in this atmosphere that we have some very dramatic events in October of 1993, when the Boris Yeltsin, who stood in front of the Russian White House, that was the home of the Russian Republic government when the Soviet Union still existed, who has now moved to the Kremlin as the president of an independent Russia, orders tanks to fire on that same White House, which now houses the Russian parliament. At least 200 will die in clashes that took place around the city in October of 1993. It's possible that, in fact, more die than this. We don't know for sure. Importantly here, Yeltsin very adroitly portrays all of this to the West as a battle between reformists, by which he means himself, and anti-reformists, which he's always holding out as communists, and the possibility of the return to communism and the return to the Cold War. And in doing this, he secures Western support for his maneuvers. Western observers, especially the Clinton administration, come to identify democracy and economic reform in the body of the person of Boris Yeltsin, even when his own actions violate those very ideals. Importantly here, then, in late 1993, a new constitution is going to be adopted. That, with, by the way, some amendments, still governs in Russia today. And this new constitution is going to greatly heighten the power of the office of the president and greatly weaken the power of the parliament. And this creates the legal conditions for authoritarianism by neutering the legislature. And the legislature in Russia still today has very little power in comparison to the Putin administration itself. So let's dive back in then to the economy and daily life. The corrupt nature of privatization prevented also the rise of an independent judiciary. And by the way, also an independent press, which though it's no longer in the hands of the government, is now a tool of the oligarchs who own all of the main television stations, newspapers, things of that sort. Now, the absence of the rule of law, the failure to develop the rule of law, right? That ideal that the law is and should be impartial, that it should apply to everyone equally, that the president should be required to follow the law just as much as any citizen should, and that courts should impartially enforce the provisions of contracts, impartially enforce the laws. The absence of this rule of law is a real fundamental problem to this day in Russia. Prosecutors, courts, tax police, secret police, again, along with the press here, they're all weapons to be used by those in power, whether we're talking about high government officials or whether we're talking about oligarchs. They're used against their rivals. Rather than being a sort of system of checks and balances, these are weapons in the hands of the wealthiest and the most powerful. Bribes become endemic throughout the entire system, something that continues to this day, all the way from the very highest realms of economic and political power to the lowest realms of somebody needing to bribe the traffic cop who pulls them over for no really good reason. So there is no independent legal system here then, right, to enforce contracts, to resolve disputes. And what this means is that you're either paying off judges and government functionaries, or you're resorting to violence. Here we see organized crime step in. We see former Soviet military and former secret police become enforcers. We'll have hundreds of murders in the 1990s in Moscow attributable to business disputes. The line, in fact, between the legal and the criminal worlds in 1990s Russia is extremely blurry. And the population, of course, the bulk of the population has no power and no wealth, and they have nowhere to turn in this system. It is also important for us to keep in mind that the Russian Federation, as it is called today, is still the product of centuries of Russian imperial colonization. Union-level republics of the Soviet Union, places like Kazakhstan, Estonia, Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, these places that were part of the Soviet Union got an internationally recognized independence after the Soviet Union collapsed. But if Joseph Stalin, who's largely the one who drew the internal maps of the Soviet Union, if he drew the map such that you lived in an ethnic enclave within one of those union-level republics, you didn't receive independence at the end of 1991, even if it's something that you desired. Russia has many such compact populations of particular ethnic groups today, some of which have demanded that they too deserved independence. One such place that I'm sure you've heard of is Chechnya. Chechnya, with a population that had suffered some of the worst of Stalinism, did not get their desired independence at the end of 1991. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details here, except to say that Chechens would come in Russian culture of the 1990s and the 2000s to be something of a boogeyman. They constantly appear in films, novels, and newspapers, first as gangsters and criminals and later as terrorists. And when they demanded independence, this led to war. Russia waged war within its own borders on Chechnya. It was a war that was incredibly brutal, a war with scenes that frankly look reminiscent of what we're seeing right now. Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, in this picture could be Mariupol today in Ukraine. Human rights violations abounded in this war, many of which, by the way, have been repeated in Ukraine in very similar ways. Different from today, though, many of these human rights violations on the Russian side were reported on Russian television and in Russian media. This is what Vladimir Putin would see as a mistake, and one that he would ensure did not happen in the Second Chechen War of the 2000s, and certainly not in the war today in Ukraine. The unpopular First Chechen War ended in 1996, but the underlying issues of this demand for independence remained, and Chechens continued to be presented negatively in Russian culture, paving the way for much more violence to come in the 2000s. Now, Boris Yeltsin was up for re-election in 1996. Given all of this that's happened, given everything that I've described, how is it remotely possible that this man was reelected? His public approval rating in 1995 stood literally, and I'm not exaggerating here, at 3%. Not 33%, which would be a terribly unpopular American president, right? But 3%. Now, like what happened in 1993, Yeltsin played off the boogeyman of communism, in this case, in the name of a man named Gennady Zyuganov, who has, by the way, been the leader of the Russian Communist Party from 1993 all the way until this moment. He was Yeltsin's main opponent in the 1996 presidential election, and Yeltsin held out the possibility of Zyuganov's victory as something to frighten the West, to frighten the United States. The United States and the West would help Yeltsin get reelected, but also, and perhaps more importantly here, he held out Zyuganov to frighten the oligarchs. The oligarchs feared the possibility that they could lose their ill-gotten wealth. So oligarchs support through money, but also especially in terms of their control of the press. They support the Yeltsin campaign in 1996. And this is absolutely critical. They will day after day after day have a drumbeat on Russian television threatening that an election of Zyuganov meant a return of totalitarianism. Now, Yeltsin will only receive 36% of the vote in the first round of the election, and Russian elections have a runoff provision if nobody receives 50%. He won a runoff election with Gennady Zyuganov, but there are still to this day rumors and some significant reasons to at least question whether Yeltsin in fact received the most votes on that day. In addition, rumors persist of secret crates of American cash, which along with the open support of American politicos, further tarnish the image of Yeltsin and Russian democracy. After this election was over, a public opinion poll found that 7% of the population approved of democracy as it then existed in Russia. So think of where we've come from the end of 1991 through this election in 1996, and what capitalism and democracy in practice have come to look like to people. Now, we'll get back to Yeltsin's second term, but let's step back a second and think about people's experience of the 1990s. This is a time of mass disillusionment. Capitalism for so many, for so long, had seemed to be the solution to everything that had ailed the Soviet economy. People imagined that the end of the Soviet Union would mean living like the characters in foreign movies and foreign television shows that they had watched. They had, in fact, an imaginary notion of what life really was like in the West. A place where the unemployment, the poverty, the racism, the homelessness, all these things that they saw day after day in Soviet propaganda, that none of this actually existed. Their government had lied to them so often that even when it showed them something about the West that was in fact true, people didn't believe it. People thought that the end of the Soviet Union would bring them that imaginary West. But not only, of course, did the end of the Soviet Union fail to bring about Western standards of living, it actually saw the collapse of the economy. Life had become worse, not better. And we can measure this in a variety of ways. Life expectancy. Life expectancy for Russian men dropped precipitously in the first half of the 1990s. By the middle of the 1990s, male life expectancy in Russia stood at 59 years, the lowest in Europe. This, by the way, was a drop of something like 5 years in just half a decade. something that's unprecedented in an industrialized country that's not involved in a massive war. Life expectancy has, by the way, recovered, but it is still low compared to Europe and even compared to the United States, which is not particularly terrific in terms of life expectancy compared to other wealthy nations. Russian life expectancy for men stands today at just about 65.5 years. This is for men. This is compared to about 75.5 for the United States. And 76 years for Russian women, a full 11 years longer, by the way, than their men. Think about the social impacts that has. But Russian women at 76 are 5 years shy of US women's life expectancy at 81 years. So if we look at the 1990s and we see this drop in life expectancy, we know that transition is in fact killing people. Now, why? What's happening? We, of course, have economic and social instability. That's the most important component here. But there's a lot of related things that go with that. Obviously, we have problems with nutrition that are coming out of all of the economic problems that they have. But we also have alcohol and drug abuse. We have high rates of tobacco consumption. At least, by the way, even today, at least twice as many people smoke in Russia as smoke in the United States. You know, we have this poor nutrition. We have depression. We have a deterioration of the healthcare system that went along with the privatization of the economy. And we have smaller factors, but that really contribute here in the 1990s. High rates of tuberculosis, especially and increasingly in Russian prisons, a drug-resistant tuberculosis, and high rates of HIV infection, especially among young IV drug users. And this, obviously, in the 1990s, as most of you, of course, remember, was not a time that surviving HIV was something that was terribly common. It was only just starting to happen in the United States, and that's obviously going to come later in a place like Russia. And all of this, right? It's actually killing people, but all of this is mixed with a disorienting cultural free-for-all. Massive, massive disorienting changes in culture. We go from a culture of sexual repressiveness to sexual free-for-all. And it's not just nudity, which was seemingly everywhere in the culture in the 90s, but honestly omnipresent pornography. Softcore porn on television at dinner time hours, hardcore porn at night on regular and satellite television. Playboy TV appeared in Russia for the first time, certainly, by the way, contributing to the sense that this filth, this smut, this decadence, however people started to think about it, that it was something coming from the West. Not to mention, of course, then what the internet is going to bring as we move into the very late 90s and into the 2000s. We have the rise of strip clubs, prostitution, often very open, especially catering to foreign businessmen. We have an objectification of women to an amazing degree in the 1990s in Russia. We have the rise of the Russian mail order bride, which was often itself a cover for human trafficking, which was a huge problem in a lot of the former Soviet states. And we have this all mixed with alcohol literally everywhere. Gin and tonic was being sold in cans out of vending machines in the 1990s. A lot of this, I remember, I was there. I spent time there. I saw these things. Young men drinking beer as they're walking to work in the morning. You go to the Sbarro, right? Like we have at the mall, and you go through and you get your pizza and pasta. And at the end, you pick up your vodka to go along with your meal. In fact, McDonald's, which of course is now closed in Russia, but McDonald's was about the only place that I could seem to find that offered food without offering alcohol to go with it. And we mix in with all of this a crude culture of violence in the 1990s. There's almost a gangster chic, whether we talk about music videos, movies, nightclubs, incredible amounts of violence on television and in films. And imagine then what this was like for a generation that had come of age watching things like the dance of mechanized agriculture, the kind of things that had appeared on the stage of the Bolshoi Theater in the 1970s. So transition was killing people, culture was disorienting, and they felt like they couldn't trust or respect their government. Yeltsin always appeared to be cowed by the West. He, of course, presided over this disaster, but he also frequently seemed either drunk or in poor health or both. He was personally corrupt. He was surrounded by corrupt oligarchs and cronies and family members who were looting the state. Yeltsin's second term would be marked by incredible instability. His health was declining. He was constantly appointing and then firing prime ministers and other ministers in the government. He had 5 prime ministers over the course of his second term, and it seemed like he was looking for a successor. But he feared the rise of a populist politician who might run on a platform of anti-corruption and might run looking a little too closely at the corruption of Yeltsin himself and the Yeltsin family. Oligarchs obviously feared the rise of a politician like this as well. And this is the atmosphere, the way of thinking that brings us in August of 1999, the appointment of Vladimir Putin as the 5th of the 5 prime ministers of Yeltsin's second term, a relatively unknown man at the time. But in the next month, in August of 1999, we have several hundred people die in apartment building bombings in Moscow and in other cities in Russia. Bombings that Russian authorities would attribute to Chechen terrorists, but that many today think were a plot of the FSB, the post-Soviet successor to the KGB that had been headed by Vladimir Putin just before he became prime minister. I cannot judge honestly the veracity of this claim. There is a lot of good evidence that seems to suggest that this is the case. But even if it's not, the mere fact that so many people believe this to be true shows you the kind of cynicism that has come. In response to those bombings that were allegedly carried out by Chechen terrorists, the Russian army entered Chechnya in late September 1999, starting the Second Chechen War. The Russian public at the time, angry over the terrorist bombings, widely supported the war. And this support translated into a growing popularity for Putin, who was shown taking decisive action in Chechnya. And it's only in this way do we see a man who is handpicked by the incredibly unpopular Boris Yeltsin. A Boris Yeltsin who will, on December 31st, 1999, resign his position as president, leaving Vladimir Putin as the interim president until an election can be carried out in March of 2000. And it's only through the way that the oligarchs controlled media coverage and through this war in Chechnya that this time was very popular, and through Putin's image as a strong man, that this man who was handpicked by a very unpopular president was able to, let's put it in quotation marks, win a presidential election in March 2000. That election, like the election of 1996 and like all subsequent Russian elections, was marred by clear signs of, frankly, the kind of election fraud that our previous president tries to conjure in his fever dreams. This is actually taking place in Russia. And Putin himself will constantly evoke the 1990s and portray himself and portray his rule as the antithesis of the 1990s. But in fact, the 1990s had paved the way for an authoritarian just like him, with its, and a reminder to us, with its economic collapse, with its incredible and unjust economic inequality, with its corruption, with its cynicism about electoral politics, with the absence of parliamentary opposition, with the absence of the rule of law, with the absence of an independent judiciary, and with the absence of an independent press. So I'll stop there. I'll be more than happy to answer questions, whether they be about Putin, whether they be about the 1990s, and I'm even willing to talk about what's going on today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much for that superb background on the rise of Vladimir Putin. It gave me a lot of insight into some of the circumstances leading up to today. So thank you. Let's see if anybody have any questions. I guess I'll lead it off and break the ice, and hopefully others will jump in. But I'm just wondering, where does that leave us today? I mean, this seems to be a pattern. What the background that you provided suggests that today's war on Ukraine is really a pattern that Russia has followed through with numerous times, and the humanitarian crimes are again a repeat of a pattern. Do you have any thoughts about where this is going to take us, perhaps?
Sure. I do think it's important that, we think about the history of Russian military involvement in various places. And among other things, that we are careful not to say that this is only something that Vladimir Putin is personally responsible for. And that's one of the reasons I like to make sure that we think about the first Chechen war in the 1990s under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin. But we have the first Chechen war, we have the second Chechen war at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s. We have the Russian involvement in war in Georgia in 2008. We, of course, in the last few years have had Russian involvement in a war in Syria. And since 2014, lest we forget, right, that February 24th, 2022 was not the beginning, but was the expansion of a Russian war on Ukraine that has been going on for 8 years now. We do have a series of events that tells us this is not just one-off, and that tell us, I think, that we have to keep in mind the longer history of Russian imperialism, of Russia today as still in many respects a product of that imperialism, of a country that is today multi-ethnic, multicultural, but not in a peaceful way in any sense. And a Russia that still continues through the eyes of Vladimir Putin, but honestly through the eyes of many in the population, that continues to claim that it has rights to territories outside of its borders. So, one thing that I fear sometimes, you'll see a lot of coverage in the news that speculates on the health of Putin. And obviously the man's not going to live forever. I don't actually myself see a tremendous amount of evidence that his demise is imminent, but we never know, right? He could, we could wake up tomorrow and read newspaper headlines that he's dead, and I, for one, would celebrate. But I would also be quite cognizant of the fact that Putin disappearing from the scene doesn't mean all of this comes to an end. And a lot of those things that I talked about that originated in the 1990s have only been enhanced ever since. Those components of authoritarian rule, the control of the press, just to talk about one of those areas, and I won't go into all of them, but let's just talk about that for a moment. I think Putin clearly saw that a press that was independent of the government, even if it wasn't, it was problematic in a lot of ways because it was in the hands of the oligarchs, but it was it was independent of the government, and it could be critical of the government. And 1990s Russian television was actually quite fascinating to watch. Lots of things that were very critical of Boris Yeltsin and those around him in his circle. And we saw a little of this still in the early stage of Vladimir Putin's presidency, but he quickly regains control, especially over television, which is still today where the majority of the Russian population gets their news from. So he gradually takes control of that part of the media world to control the way that he's covered, but he leaves a bit of independent media out there, at least some appearance of democracy, some appearance of pluralism. And what we've seen since February 24th is a dramatic acceleration of a process that had been going on for 20 years of clamping down on independent media and really truly closing down all independent media so that the one remaining independent Russian television station with a critical voice, well, they've actually just started operation again in the last couple of days from Latvia because they had to leave the country for fear of arrest. The one, most important independent voice in the newspaper world, one of the publishers of which won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, that's fled the country and has opened up operations outside of Russia. And so we see this way in which there was this constant clamping down on what sources of information people could have. But that's something that doesn't start with Vladimir Putin, right? It starts in the 1990s. And that's really what I want to try to get across, is the origins of this precisely in a decade that we as Americans, I think, have a tendency to romanticize, because we were excited about the end of the Cold War. I was excited. I was a young man. As a college student, it was so exciting to see what was going on. The fact that I do this for a living, the fact that I'm a Russian historian, has everything to do with that era and the excitement of that era. But what I try to explain to my students is that for those who lived through it, it wasn't necessarily excitement, it was collapse. It was their world collapsing around them. So I'm trying to understand those kinds of origins for all of this.
I have a question, unless you're going to the chat.
Yes, there is a question here or a comment that the war in Ukraine helps this participant see how important a free press is.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. It doesn't mean that a free press is, of course, going to automatically entail the entirety of the Russian population would suddenly stop supporting Putin or stop supporting the war, but it makes it much, much more difficult for anybody who might be wavering, for anybody who's curious to find out information. They can, but it's more difficult now, right? And every time you make it more difficult, then fewer people are going to get that information. So Russians can use VPNs, right? Which allow them to spoof their IP address, which makes it appear that they're not in Russia, which gives them access to internet sites that are not freely available in Russia. But that's a series of technical hoops that becomes more difficult for people to jump through to actually get access to independent sources of information. And so it just means fewer and fewer people are going to find out what's really happening. And, without that kind of knowledge, I mean, you repeatedly say, I mean, it's so distressing to hear stories of people in Ukraine who have family or friends in Russia who call them and literally tell them what's happening right around them, and be told that they're lying, be told that, no, this wasn't Russia. Russia didn't do this. NATO did this. You did it to yourself. The Ukrainians did it to their, all of these kinds of things. And it's because of that drumbeat day after day after day of what people are hearing, and how it feeds into a very long history of stereotypical notions of what Ukrainians are and what it means to be Ukrainian, and whether Ukrainians really were an independent people, and all of these kinds of things. It feeds on things that are much longer in the making. But yeah, I think an independent press is absolutely critical.
We have a very astute observation in the chat that it sounds like these events echo what happened in Nazi Germany with, the free press. And then we have another question: has Russia ever experienced democracy? And if so, when?
So let me take each of those in turn. First off, by the way, there are certainly echoes of a variety of things that we can talk about from the past. This is one of the reasons, by the way, I highly recommend you attending these sessions of this seminar series that I'm hosting in the fall, where I'm going to ask historians to really specifically grapple with this question. How does the things that they have researched in the past, how does that help us understand what's happening in this moment in the present? But one person that I would point you to in particular, actually maybe two authors I would point you to: Tim Snyder, who has a really terrific short book called On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. And he's really taking the lessons of European history in the 20th century and applying them. And he wrote this primarily in the moment after the election of Donald Trump in the United States, but a lot of it very much applies to Russia and what happens to Russia in the 90s and the 2000s and the rise of authoritarianism. And a lot of it really helps us, I think, to understand what's happening now with the war in Ukraine. He has just put out an expanded version of that in which he directly grapples with the question of the war in Ukraine. So I highly recommend taking a look at that and really thinking through quite seriously how the rise of authoritarianism is something that's not just happening in Russia, right? If we look at Hungary, if we look at Poland, if we look at ourselves, if we look in a mirror, if we try to make sure that we don't say all of this just happens over there and it happens back then and it's something that never could apply to us. it would cause us to be really, really critical, to be really sort of careful, to think really closely about what's happening in our own societies. I'm not here to tell you what to think politically, but I'm here to tell you that we always have to understand the possibility that this could happen to us. History shows us that democracies often fail. And so this, this brings me to the other question, has Russia ever experienced democracy? And it has, but in very short moments. There really was Russian democracy at the very beginning of the 1990s. There was a chance. In fact, in some respects, the most democratic moment was the very end of the Soviet Union, before the Soviet Union collapsed, those last couple of years. For me, in many respects, this moment of Russian democracy, which is a short one, dies in October of 1993. It dies when a president sends armed individuals, sends tanks, sends those with armed weapons, right? Sends people with weapons against a legislature. When a president sends people with weapons against a legislature, it's really problematic, right? The American Secretary of State at the time, Warren Christopher, after literally tanks, right? Tanks are firing on the parliament. Warren Christopher, the Secretary of State in the United States at the time, said, well, we don't normally condone tanks firing on a legislature, but in this case, we'll make an exception. That moment, that constitution that's adopted at the end of 1993, to me, that's when Russian democracy died, not in 2000 with the rise of Putin, but in 1993, when the legislature no longer has any significant power in the system. And honestly, they never really fully develop a rule of law democracy. And I think that issue of the rule of law is so much more critical than people realized at the time. The idea that there should be an independent judiciary, the idea that everybody should have to follow the law. Just because you're president doesn't mean that you can avoid following the law, right? This is a principle that Russia never followed in the 1990s. And it's, again, for me, it's the kind of thing that, hey, we got to look in our mirrors and make sure we're careful that this kind of thing doesn't happen to us. There are some other moments. I mean, I think we could talk about 1917. In 1917, there are two revolutions that happen. There's one that overthrows the Tsar in February of 1917, well, March, according to our calendar. That is overthrown by the communists, by the Bolsheviks in October of that year. So again, it's a short period. It doesn't last long. What I want us to be careful of, and the reason, by the way, that I point out that poll in the beginning, and I say, look, in 1991, a slim majority, but a majority of the Russian population supported a democratic form of government, is that I don't want us to wind up with the notion that, well, there's something genetically wrong with Russians. There's something wrong with Russian political culture and it can never be fixed. And that's absolutely not the case. There are moments, but then we have to look at the history of what happened and why democracy did not succeed in those moments. And we have to step back with a bit of humility and say, democracy fails all the time in history. It's precious and it doesn't necessarily last. It's not necessarily the default feature of human forms of government. And so when we have it, we have to fight to protect it. So there's a couple, Sheila, of messages of questions that have come just to me, and so I'll read them and try to respond. So one is, what does Russia gain by destroying another country? And the other is asking whether I can comment on the entry of Finland and Sweden into NATO and Russia's need to have access to the Baltic. And so let me handle the second one first. First off, I think it's really important that we understand that NATO has always been pretext, not cause here. So the so-called expansion of NATO that Russia and Putin have complained about doesn't actually threaten Russia in the way that Russia wants us to believe. And I don't think that Russia is, and I don't think that Putin has ever actually felt threatened by NATO. I think that's all smokescreen. It's designed for certain audiences. The ironic thing, of course, is that Putin complained about the expansion of NATO and, in fact, got a further expansion of NATO. But when we talk about the expansion of NATO and the way Putin talks about it, and again, I don't think it's cause, but it's rhetoric. And so we should look at it and think about Putin's rhetoric. When Putin talks about NATO, he takes away the agency of all these countries that have joined NATO since 1989. There's a reason that Poland wants to be part of NATO. You know the number of times that Poland has been wiped off of the international map? You know how Russia has been involved in those times that Poland has been wiped off the international map? We can talk about the Soviet hand on the Polish government through the Cold War era. The Poles want to be in NATO because the Poles want protection from Russia. This isn't about the United States demanding that Poland join NATO. This is Poland demanding that they be allowed into NATO. And so with Finland and Sweden, it's the same kind of thing, right? They feel threatened in this moment by an authoritarian leader who seems not to want to follow the international rules. And so they want to join NATO now in a way that they never had. I think this question of what Russia gets out of destroying another country, I think there's a couple of things happening here, and it's complicated. And I think, to get into Putin's psyche and why he thinks the things he does and why he's done the things that he's done, I think Putin is fundamentally an imperialist. I think Putin fundamentally operates on a notion that Ukrainians are not a real people, that Ukrainians are some kind of historical invention. He wrote last July, and absolutely, so as a history professor, I would have failed the man. He wrote a historical discussion of the history of Ukraine and the involvement of Ukraine and Russia and these kinds of things, and basically denied the existence of the Ukrainian people, said it was an invention of outside powers designed to weaken Russia. I'm sorry, the historical record just does not show us this. But I think Putin honestly believes that there is one Russian people of which there are three parts: Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. And he believes they're all actually truly Russians. And I think this has a lot to do with what's going on. There are competing claims, and I think Putin feels very deeply in his soul this idea that that Russian origins are in Kiev. This is a problematic understanding of history, to say the least. But he believes that this is originally and deservedly Russian territory. I think that's part of it. I do think part of what's going on here is Putin's fear of the revolutionary nature of the Ukrainian population, of the way that they are willing to rise up and to protest in moments of problematic elections. If we go back to the Orange Revolution in 2004, there's an election that was clearly falsified. Its results in the Ukrainian people turned out until the Ukrainian Supreme Court forced a rerun of that election. Now, why would this be threatening to Putin in a country in which every single election has exactly these kinds of falsifications taking place? I think we can see where that comes from. So I think a democratic Ukraine that is leaning toward Europe, that's leaning toward the European Union. And of course, until this war, there were no plans for Ukraine to join the European Union. But a Ukraine that can be free, a Ukraine that can potentially be prosperous, is a threat to Putin and to the Putin regime, because it might provide Russians with an example of what they might have if they don't have Putin. So anyway.
Kind of the opposite of the domino effect we were also worried about in the Vietnam era, the democratization, the
yeah, I think there's something to that, Sheila, definitely.
I think we're headed to a new world order with Russia aligned with China and maybe Iran and the rest of the world.
There's somebody knit, I think it is. If I don't.
That's not my name.
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
that's not my name. For some reason, it got up there, Sheila. But question is, I've been watching this war from the very, very beginning, and I don't see how there could be an end to this without the Ukrainians being able to totally crush Russia and push them out of the Donbass and in the south. And I don't think they're going to be able to do that. And I just don't see Putin giving up, giving an inch if he doesn't have to. And I don't see the Ukrainians being able, in spite of their heart, to push Russia out of those territories for the most part. So how is this going to end? I know you can't answer that, but I'm throwing it at you anyway.
No, and look, I think it's a really good question. Look, my prognosis is that this is going to last for a good long time. My prognosis and my prediction, and look, I'm a historian. I study the past, and I'll come to you in 5 years and I'll tell you what happened, and I'll tell you why what happened was inevitable. But right now, take any prediction I make with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I don't see this coming to an end anytime soon, in part because at the moment, I think Putin believes that he can outlast what he sees as the weakness of democratic systems. That he believes that he can impose economic pain on Germany, on the United States, on France, on Eastern Europe, right, on these countries. And because they have an electorate and they are responsible to their electorate, something Putin doesn't have to worry about. And look, we've seen them talk about this quite specifically on Russian television. Russian television is holding all kinds of hopes right now on the midterm elections in the United States. They believe that if the Republicans take power in Congress in the midterm elections, that they will force Biden to back down. This is exactly what they're saying on television. So I think Putin believes that he can outlast democracies. And he sees that as a weakness of democracies. And obviously, and here's the one thing, right? And the Ukrainians have been amazing. Oh my goodness. You know, the way that they have stood up, the way that they have come together, what this has done for creating a truly unified civic Ukrainian nation is quite amazing to watch. I feel for the pain that they're going through. I have friends, right, who talk about what's going on, and, you know, I feel for what they're going through. But honestly, right, if they don't continue to receive support from outside powers, especially through the provision of weapons, they're in the long run in real trouble. And that's what Putin is holding out for. If it were me, I mean, I would like to see us provide greater weaponry to Ukraine sooner, because I think we are helping to prolong it. And the only way is to make this so painful for Putin that he, you know, that he backs off, that he maybe claims the territory that he's occupying and tries to impose some kind of ceasefire. But Ukrainians aren't going to stand for that, certainly. And we shouldn't ask them to.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if somebody came in and you know, if a foreign power came and took Texas,
That'd be a good idea.
I understand it's a joke, right? And you know, it's obviously something that's hard to imagine in reality.
Yeah.
But imagine some portion of the United States was taken by a foreign power, and you had more powerful countries saying, well, you know, if you want peace, you're just going to have to let that go.
Yeah.
I don't see us doing that. And I don't believe we should ask Ukrainians to do that. It needs to be the Ukrainians' decision. But of course, you know, will the United States and the European political system stand up to the need to stand behind Ukraine for the long run? And that's the unknowable to me, I think.
Okay, well, I think
Okay.
I have the last word. Thank you for all of your questions. We appreciate it. We are going to have to wrap it up. I would like to thank you so much, Professor Barnes. This was really illuminating, very insightful, gets everybody thinking. I really appreciate your giving us the benefit of your experience and expertise. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
And enjoyed talking to everybody, and definitely please feel free to come and join us in the fall. I have a really fantastic group of historians that are going to come and speak. I'm gonna give the first talk. It'll be very different than what I did today. So I'm gonna just try to reflect on how, as a historian, I've tried to come to understand what's going on. How does a historian try to understand a moment like this, a war like this? But I've asked a number of really fantastic historians, Ukrainians. We're working on, we hope we're going to have some historians from Lviv in Ukraine who are going to be part of one of our events. We have historians from around the United States, from the United Kingdom. And so I would love to have you there as my guest, and feel free. In the meantime, you can easily find out how to contact me on the George Mason website, and, be happy to hear from you and try to answer any questions that I couldn't get to today. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
And Charlene had kindly re-entered the link for more information and to register for the speaker series into the chat. So you can find it there, and I will follow up with an email sending that as well. I really appreciate your making that available to us. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks.
Fabulous.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Take care. Everybody be well. Thank you, Professor Barnes.